So, what can we learn from 1929? Today, we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon and welcome to the Prudent Money Radio Show. I'm your host, Bob Brooks. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. 1929, inside the greatest crash in Wall Street history and how it shattered a nation. A book that every investor should read because it is a stark reminder of what could happen with financial markets when they get out of control. New York best-selling author Andrew Ross Sorkin is here to talk to us about his book, 1929, Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History and How It Shattered a Nation. Andrew, welcome to Prudent Money.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Hey, listen, congratulations. Your book, and I really do believe this, is a must-read book for anyone who invests. I mean, history is rich with lessons that we just have a tendency as human beings to forget about. And this book is a realistic reminder of how the stock market really works.
Well, that my hope was to teach a lesson to most people today about what happened back then more than anything else. It was really an effort to sort of bring us all back to that period of time. Not necessarily because I think there's a crash coming tomorrow where we are today, but I think that unfortunately history does repeat. But if we know it a little bit better, maybe we can prevent that from happening.
Absolutely, and that has been the message on the radio shows. We talk a lot about using history as a guide, and you talk about in books about what happens during these types of time periods. Talk a little bit about some of the similarities between today and 29 that you're seeing.
Well, really, it's even just to go back and think about the 1920s and where we are today in our own economy. I mean, the 1920s was really this remarkable shift in technology. You had the automobile,
right.
You had, Charles Lindbergh with airplanes, and then you had stock trading really for the very first time, and you had radio. So there were lots of things that people were excited about. Obviously, today we're super excited about artificial intelligence, but back then it was all of the sort of new technology, the construction of New York City and everything else that was going on. But what was so interesting about that particular period was it was all powered for the very first time by debt, by credit, and by borrowing. And that's really the main ingredients which actually creates the panic. Back before, call it 1919, most people never took out a loan to buy stock. That was to buy stock or anything, frankly. It was really General Motors in 1919 sure changed the culture of America in this regard. They wanted to sell more cars, and the way they decided to do that was to say, well, we'll loan people money so they can afford to buy our cars. And once that shift happened, Sears Roebuck did the same thing, and then it was just off to the races. And then Wall Street obviously sees what's happening and says, okay, well, we're going to start loaning people money so you can buy stock. And, come the late 20s, people were buying stock like a pastime. It really became a national pastime the way I think today people think about the stock market and crypto and people sort of playing the markets, today on Reddit or what have you. That's
right.
What was happening then. And there was a real move it was all sort of done under the guise of democratizing finance. The folks who had had the opportunities in the past were the elites, and this was a way to allow everybody to play. But there wasn't a lot of transparency. There was a lot of manipulation going on, and there was a lot of FOMO and YOLO dreaming. And I think when you look at what's going on today and some of the economics around artificial intelligence and a lot of the leverage in the artificial intelligence universe to build out these data centers, the borrowing that's taking place, some of the circular deals that are happening, I think those are red flags. I think the world of private credit and venture capital and crypto, a lot of red flags. There's a lot of leverage in those systems, again, without the transparency and potentially with some, hopefully not the kind of manipulation that we had back in the 1920s, because we do have things like the SEC now and the FDIC, and we have rules that we didn't have then. But a lot of the things that do happen in this quote-unquote shadow banking system, we still don't know fully about. And so
right.
I think those are some of the parallels we got to be careful on.
It's interesting. You bring up where AI, where it is kind of in the cycle of things. Gosh, this just reminds me so much of '99 in the tech
Yeah.
bust, where you had companies being pitched that had no earnings, they didn't have anything, they just had an idea. People were just throwing money at it.
Well, what's so interesting now is you have companies that aren't making money doing it. So think about an OpenAI, which, by the way, I'm super impressed by the technology of what they're doing.
Yes.
Without question. Same thing with Anthropic, same thing with so many others. And some of them, including Google, obviously have huge balance sheets, but they're pouring so much of their balance sheet to the extent they have it into AI, similar with Meta and others, that I think there's going to be a big question mark just about what kind of value can be extracted from all of these large language models, and whether all these large language models in the end also converge, meaning that they all basically become a commodity, they become similar. And then there's the other question about what kind of moat exists around their business, and separately, what kind of moat exists around almost any business in an artificial intelligence world. Because if these models are as successful as we say they're going to be, all of them will basically be able to do the same thing. And therefore, where's the margin? And I think that's the question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation. With the way I've always looked at it is AI has just gotten so out in front of the opportunity, and it's going to take a while for all that to connect. And will Wall Street give them that time, the time to connect? It's going to be interesting to watch.
Well, part of it's a capital story too. I mean, how much capital can you continue to raise? OpenAI, Anthropic, some of these others, they need to just continue to raise capital to build out these data centers. And, there was a period of time where people thought, for example, that Tesla wasn't going to make it. And one of the reasons that people didn't think Tesla was going to make it was because the economics of those vehicles didn't make sense. But
right.
One of the things that Elon Musk did that I don't think people appreciated was part of the strategy or the competitive advantage was his access to capital. People don't think of access to capital as a competitive advantage always, but he had it, and as a result, he was able to, ride out a scenario that, could have pinched him. And the question, of course, for I think a lot of these AI players is, can they ride out, an economic scenario that I think in a normal course would pinch you, but maybe doesn't. You talked about the 1990s. I remember covering Amazon. People used to call it Amazon.bomb, Amazon.com.
Right.
A company that made no money. No money. It always appeared to be losing money. And yet they also, had patient investors and patient capital. Now, they were not continuing to raise money. They managed to work it out. So it wasn't like a continual sort of, train to Wall Street to ask for more money. But there were, legitimate questions back then about whether they were going to make it, and they did. So that's the hardest part about judging all of this, which is
sure.
It could cut a whole different bunch of ways.
You brought up, we talked a little bit, or you brought up a while ago, margin debt, and I wanted to kind of explain what that means and what the risk there is, because that to me seemed like the gasoline that ignited the fire.
Look, margin debt is what is the gasoline that lights every fire of every panic. I would say leverage debt, borrowing is the match that lights the fire of every single financial crisis. You could have, all sorts of things happening that don't seem economic, but it's the borrowing that hurts you. So back in 1929, you had lots of people walking into brokerage houses, and they would loan you. You could put down $1, they would loan you $10. So for every $1 you gave them, they'd loan you $10. And as long as the market was going up, that was like free money. So from 1928 to September 1929, stock market went up 90%. Talk about FOMO. Everybody wanted in because they thought, oh my goodness, look at this. And by the way, if you had only put down $1 and they'd lent you 10, think about just how much money you were making.
Sure,
it was extraordinary. Sure. But then come October 1929 into November 1929, the stock market falls 50%. And it wasn't just that equities were now down 50%, it was that you owed 10 times that amount. And most Americans had never planned on that. So all of a sudden they're mortgaging their homes, they're selling their houses, they're, and then businesses are going out of business because they had invested, they're losing their jobs, and it became this self-fulfilling, vicious cycle. one of the great surprises, I think, for a lot of people who read the book is the stock market in 1929, by the end of the year, was actually only down 17%. And you think,
it's pretty amazing.
And you think 17% is not much. That's okay. The problem was most people couldn't survive long enough to get to the 17%, because it wasn't that they could just hold on. What was happening is the banks are calling them up saying, your stock is down 50%. You have to make a margin call. And you had taken all those money. You got to pay us back now. And people couldn't afford to pay them back. And that's what happens every time you have people get overextended. And to some degree, it's not as acute today. So, most banks won't even lend you more than, $2 for every dollar you give, maybe $3. Crypto, there's some interesting instruments out there that are 20 to 1, 50 to 1, and some of the crazy stuff going on some of these international exchanges and things like that. But hopefully that piece of it shouldn't be as bad. I think the bigger question today on debt is how much debt is sloshing around the system in some of these big AI investments, not just about semiconductors, but about real estate and the energy complex that's building out these things, and so much of that's in the private credit space, meaning it's not just a loan from a bank. So we actually don't, meaning we, the public, we don't have the same kind of disclosure or awareness of just exactly how intermingled all these loans are. In fact, the Federal Reserve doesn't even either. So those are sort of my red flags right now.
Let's talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve, because they were a part of this story as well.
Huge.
Inaction, action. I mean, what could they have done different? How much did they contribute to the crash?
Oh, it's a great question. So much of what was happening in the spring of 1929 was almost identical to what's happening right now in certain ways, which is there was a massive debate inside the Federal Reserve about, was there too much speculation in the system? What was going to happen to employment? Should they raise interest rates? Should they cut interest rates? If they raise them too high, are they going to tip over the economy? If they cut them, are they going to create an even greater speculative fervor? And the interesting part about that is, politically back then, the Federal Reserve was still actually a very new institution. So it was born in 1913. In 1929, they still called it an experiment to a large degree. And so there was a lot of political pressure on the Federal Reserve governors, not from the president the way there is today, but pressure in the sense that look through some of the diaries that I was reading as I was writing this book of those members, and they were worried that, not only are they going to get called in front of Congress if, in fact, they raise interest rates and the whole economy tips over, but that, the entire experiment, the Federal Reserve, could be disbanded at that point. So I think there was a lot of political pressure, frankly, to do nothing ahead of the crash. What could have they done? They could have raised interest rates meaningfully, but you probably would have had to do what Paul Volcker did, and that would have really tipped over the economy as well. So I think that was it. And then the question is always not just what do you do ahead of a crisis, what do you do on the after side of it. So if you can't stem the panic, what do you do once you have the panic? The answer, and I think we learned it in 2008, actually Ben Bernanke, by the way, did his thesis at Princeton on this. He was the Fed chairman in 2008. He learned that in a crisis, what you need to do is throw money at the problem. You need to bail out the banks. You need to provide liquidity, even if it's politically unpalatable. That's, by the way, why you need an independent Fed, because you're going to have to do a lot of things that politically people may not want you to do. By the way, we learned this also even in the pandemic. Government threw a lot of money at the problem. Some people say too much money at the problem, but that's how you prevent the economy from falling over. Now, the bigger question longer term is, at some point we're going to get to a moment where we're going to think, the right answer is to have a bailout. And at some point, the bond market in America, I think, that you guys have borrowed just way too much money. And, we're happy to continue loaning you money, but only if you pay us a crazy high interest rate. And at that point, that could then, spill over and really shake up the whole economics of our whole country.
It's really interesting when you look at all the different actors and different components of the economy. I mean, I think the bond market has got to be one of the riskiest places to be.
Look, I have been surprised for a long time about how steady the bond market has been. I would have thought a long time ago that investors would say, you guys have a lot of debt. This seems like a problem. But life is relative a little bit. There's not a lot of other places people can put their money and feel like they're going to get paid back later. And I think there's a view that, we may be the cleanest shirt in a dirty shirt, a hamper, a hamper of shirts. So
Yeah.
that's the question. And it's not so much that you need the investor class to believe that you can pay it all back in 1 minute, because of course you can't. It's just that the investor class needs to believe that there's a path, that there's always a path back,
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. Talking to Andrew Ross Sorkin about a great book that he's written, and I said this at the beginning, I'll say it now. I think every investor should be reading this because it gives them a look at what the past has to say about today. It's called 1929, Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History, and how it shattered a nation. Let's talk a little bit about the banks. And correct me if I'm wrong. National City Bank is actually what was the original Citibank, right?
Well, National City is what is Citigroup today. City is that bank. And back then, it was the largest bank in the country. 1929. It was on the verge of becoming the largest bank in the world. It was run by a guy named Charlie Mitchell. They called him Sunshine Charlie. And Charlie really was he's probably as famous as Jamie Dimon. I mean, this is also the first era where CEOs are on the cover of magazines and in newspapers. I mean, this never happened before. Prior to this period, maybe you'd see actors or, Babe Ruth or an athlete on the cover of a magazine. But this was the era where finance started almost to eclipse everything else.
And of course, you also have in these periods of boom and everything that was happening in the 20s, the fraud gets discovered, and it was talk a little bit about the investment pools. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah, no, they called them investment pools. That's maybe the polite word for scams.
Right.
A lot of the elites were involved in these pools, which are basically pump and dump schemes, where they would basically press up a stock. They were paying off the journalists to write nice articles about what was going to happen to the stock. People knew about it. It was open that they were doing this. And actually, a lot of investors in the public, people who had nothing to do with who weren't technically part of the pool, if you will, they knew that for the next couple of weeks, these guys were probably going to try to get the stock to go higher. And so people were trying to jump in and out of the stock quickly. And then, of course, they knew the day they planned to pull the rug, meaning the day they were going to sell this, everyone's going to sell. And a lot of the elites were part of this, and it was completely legal. I mean, it was, back then there was no SEC. Insider trading was legal. There was no problem with it. And so it wasn't even, I don't want to say it wasn't, actually, it's interesting. I went back to see, was there anybody who didn't participate in these things just for moral reasons, because they felt uncomfortable about it? Nobody did. I mean, people really thought that this was okay. But it's interesting because the reason they thought it was okay was because, the markets to some degree have always been a business about outwitting the other side, right? Whoever's buying a stock thinks they're smarter than the person selling a stock. And whoever's selling a stock in that moment thinks they're smarter than the person buying the stock. And so I think back then, because there were no rules, people thought, oh, well, if I can sort of manipulate the stock, that's just me outwitting the other guy on the other side,
Now, tell me this, because there's of course always stories of politicians trying to fix things, and like you said, there wasn't a whole lot of regulation. The SEC had, I think, SEC was 1932. Is that right? Does that sound right?
SEC was 1934.
34.
1933 was Glass-Steagall, which broke up the banks. The investment banks, commercial banks were separated. That's actually how Morgan Stanley was created. Actually, that happened to be the investment bank that was part of J.P. Morgan. It had to be split off back then, and then you had the Banking Act of 1940, the FDIC to insure deposits that came out in 1933 as well. So a whole bunch of things were happening, but all of that didn't exist in 1929. So
what do you think that the 20s would have looked like had that existed, or stronger regulations?
I mean, I think it would have been very hard to pull off all the manipulation component. I think it would have been a lot harder for the kind of leverage to exist in the system, because all of a sudden there were, by 1940 there were bank capital requirements. Banks didn't have to keep a certain amount of money on hold. You know what I mean? So people were willing to really just roll the dice there were disclosure requirements about companies. I mean, somebody asked me the other day, when you're researching this book, did you ever read a prospectus for one of these stocks? What did that look like? I said, a prospectus? Are you kidding me? If there was a leaflet, you'd be surprised. So, I think all of those things, transparency, capital requirements, all of that, I think, really would have made it a lot better. And so hopefully you wouldn't have had the crash the same way. But the other thing to think about is the crash unto itself didn't create the Great Depression. It wasn't a straight line. It was a series of policy choices. The crash is what really led to the confidence getting sucked out of the system initially. But then you had a president in President Hoover who made a series of frankly poor choices. He was trying to raise taxes just at a time when the economy was faltering. He was implementing the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, in 1930, which, by the way, created, global trade dropped by about 60% a year later because of the tariffs. And it's actually very similar to today in a certain way, because back then all the economists were telling him, don't do it, don't do it. He had promised all these farmers in 1920, he was trying to get the farmers to vote for him in 1928 to become president. So he promised them, I'm going to implement these tariffs and it's going to help you. But it really obviously upended so much of the economy. And then the question about saving the banks, there was a view, let the banks fail. And so by 1932, 1933, we had 25% unemployment in the country. If you think about it, 25% of the people in the country were unemployed.
Right.
9,000 banks are out of business. They're literally gone bankrupt, with no protections on money you had left in the bank. So there was no FDIC. So the reason why you saw those pictures of people literally, standing around, around the streets, on the sidewalk, literally around the building, is because people were rushing to get their money out, which then, of course, creates a run on the bank, which almost precipitates the failure.
With the Fed willing to print money and, willing to print money with no boundaries, do you think we're better protected now, or maybe just exposed in different ways?
Well, I say a little bit better, but maybe exposed in different ways. And the reason is, and this is actually worth mentioning, back then we couldn't print money because we were on the gold standard.
Right.
And what that meant was that for every dollar, you really had to have gold backing it. Once you decided you didn't have to be tied to gold, then you could do whatever you wanted. And that's where we are right now. And that's actually created a lot of latitude for us and, frankly, for a lot of other countries around the world. But the larger question, which I think you're getting to, is has it exposed us to some other risk? And invariably it has, but for whatever reason, it has not come home to roost yet, despite, I think, a lot of folks, including myself, who've been worried about it for a long time.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. We're talking about a great book, 1929, Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History, and how it shattered a nation. Last question, and I think this is always what you want people to benefit from what you're writing and your work and that type of thing. What is the single most important lesson long-term investors should be taking from 1929?
Watch your leverage. Focus on the debt, always. Your own debt and everybody else's debt, and how interconnected that debt can be. And then watch your own level of confidence. Don't get sucked into the FOMO of it all. Don't think to yourself, well, the train's leaving the station, I got to get on the train, otherwise I'm never going to have an opportunity. I think part of what happened in 1929 and part of what happened in 2008 and what happened in the late 90s and everything else is always a sense of overconfidence. We all need a level of humility that we don't want to allow for.
1929 is the name of the book. Congratulations, Andrew. I appreciate you coming on the program.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Once again, the name of the book, it's a New York Times best-selling book, 1929. And also, I didn't mention this, but Andrew also wrote Too Big to Fail, which was about the financial crisis in 2008. Just a lot of great information. It really teaches you as an investor how markets work, and they don't always work like you think they're going to, and I think that's why so many people lose so much money and things turn out the way they do. This gives you a great guide, and through stories and all types of things that he's put in the book to really educate, and so people can learn from history, learn from mistakes that have been made instead of making them as well. So once again, 1929, Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History and How It Shattered a Nation. And the author is Andrew Ross Sorkin. This is Bob Brooks. If you got a question for me, go to the website, www.prudentmoney.com. For today, we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time. Keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.